Welcome, everybody, to the Distorian's Lounge. This is the Kate-only version of Distory. My podcast co-host is absent this week, but that means that we get to talk about really obscure things in older Disney history, usually Disneyland, and that's what we're going to do tonight on the Distorian's Lounge. So tonight we're going to talk about 10 tree stories you should know about in Disneyland, or tree-mendous tree stories, if you will. I'm going to just channel Kirk for that dad joke there. But I have 10 really fun stories about some trees that you may or may not have heard about in Disneyland. This came from a larger live stream that I did that was on TikTok, where I talked about 20 stories about trees, but I'm going to truncate it a little bit because I realized that it was about 10 pages worth of notes, and 10 pages is probably about a 3-hour podcast, and that was a little bit too much. So I'm going to just tell the shorter versions of some of these stories to make this manageable for all of us, including myself, because I am headed to Walt Disney World with my family in just a couple of hours. So, but this week you get Kate for the Distorian's Lounge. So I'm really happy to be here with you guys before I head off and enjoy my family at Walt Disney World. Alrighty, so the first story, I have little names for these stories, and these are just really fun names I made up. These are not Disney official. These are not Disney history official. These are just fun names that I made up to just kind of keep track of what story I was telling. So the first story that we're going to tell is one that I call the maybe sometimes tree. So in the 1960s, Bill Evans, who was one of the main landscapers of Disneyland, he wanted to purchase a large reclinata palm. So this is like a really expensive tree, okay, that has multiple palm trees branching off of it. It was a multi-trunk palm that could grow up to 35 feet in height. So it wasn't a small tree. It wasn't an inexpensive tree. But Walt kept putting him off, saying, yeah, we'll do that one of those days. I promise. And that's what Rolly Crump is remembering that. But unfortunately, Walt Disney passed away before they could get the tree at all. So that means that Bill Evans, he decided, you know what? I'm going to go spend my own money, and I'm going to go buy this tree, and I'm going to plant it in Disneyland as a tribute to Walt Disney. So he did. He went to Santa Barbara solo, paid $3,000 for the tree himself, and arranged for it to be delivered to Anaheim to Disneyland. Then one night in early 1967, him and Rolly Crump planted it next to the Carousel of Progress and Autopia. And that tree is still there in that exact same location today. So you can find this if you are in Disneyland. And it's now Star Wars Launch Bay. It's that building that's having kind of an identity crisis, which used to be the Carousel of Progress before GE insisted that it moved to Florida because they wanted less repeat customers. That's why it moved, in case you didn't know about that. But the Star Wars Launch Bay is here. And then you can see, if you just go off to kind of near the exit of Autopia, this is not the best picture, but you can see there's a little palm tree back there. But this is the reclinata palm that is a tribute to Walt Disney. Now, there's no signage for this. This is something you would just have to know. There's no memorial plaque. There's nothing. It's just, this was what Bill Evans wanted to do to honor Walt Disney inside Disneyland. Yeah. So one of my favorite trees, every time I go to Tomorrowland, I stop and just think about Walt Disney a little bit and how he was gone too soon. So that is the maybe sometimes tree. And I feel like I've talked about this one a lot, so I know it's starting to get more well-known, not just because of me, but it was also published in a really wonderful book. I want to say it's Walt Disney's Disneyland. That's Marcy Creeker Smothers wrote a really good book that had that story in it as well. So it's starting to get a little bit more well-known, which I think is wonderful. All right, so let's do our next story. And this one is what I call the Little Miracle Tree. So most people don't even know that this tree is a thing, and it is labeled in Disneyland. But let's cycle back just a little bit to talk about Herb Ryman. Now, Herb Ryman was the one that designed all of Disney's castles. So he designed Sleeping Beauty Castle, he designed Cinderella Castle. He is the Disney castle designer, if you will. He unfortunately got really sick near the end of his life with cancer. And so it was hard to keep his spirits up because he was bedridden at that point. So someone got him a small spruce Christmas tree and put it on the piano that was in his room where he was in bed and stuck there. Because they wanted to give him some hope at this point. I think it was October, to hold on until Christmas. They're like, maybe if we get him a Christmas tree, he'll, hold on a little bit. So Herb Ryman, or Herbie, as Imagineers called him, as those who knew him called him, loved his little tree, and he called it his little miracle tree. And so Disneyland's landscaper Bill Evans, again, couldn't figure out how the tree continued to grow and thrive in the dark environment of Herb Ryman's room. Like, it didn't make any sense, because it wasn't like it wasn't getting any light. Like, how is it still growing? How is it doing this? And Herbie said how much he appreciated the beauty of new life on the tree, and it was the first time in his life he had ever just watched a tree grow, which I think is very beautiful in itself. After Christmas had come and gone, his sister took the tree out while he was sleeping. Herb asked, "Where is my tree?" And she said she'd taken it out because she was afraid it wouldn't survive in the dark room. Herb demanded that his tree be restored to his room, and so they rescued it from the trash collector. This little miracle tree stayed alive in that dim room until February of 1989, when Herb Ryman passed away. So at that point, a group of Imagineers gathered to the right of Sleeping Beauty Castle, and they dedicated the tree to Herb Ryman, and they planted it there. And this is one of my favorite parts, is that they buried it with a glass of champagne so that Herb Ryman could toast his life with them. And I really wonder if it's still there today, if the glass is still underneath the tree, because the tree is there, but it's not the same miracle tree. The tree has since moved on, but there is a little spruce tree that is to the right of Sleeping Beauty Castle, and it looks like this. You can tell it's the right one because it has a little sign underneath it that says genus artisticus, species Rymanus. And that is the tribute to Herb Ryman, so that he can forever spend his time next to the castle that he designed, which I think is very, very special and truly one of my favorite tree stories. So I'm just really curious if that glass is still underneath there anywhere. Like, did they remove it when they swapped out the tree? But I don't know for sure. Hopefully someday maybe I can talk to somebody on the landscaping team and ask if they know if the glass is still underneath there, but we'll see. So the next story that we have in our tremendous tree stories is the Tree of Dreams. This is all about the two dreaming trees that we have in the park. Now, this is a pretty common story that people know, that in Marceline, Missouri, where Walt Disney grew up, not his whole life, but a significant portion of his memorable childhood was then. He grew up and he had what he called his dreaming tree, and he would sit under it and he would draw and sketch, the critters and whatnot that were out and about. And so his dreaming tree did survive for quite a while, but it was struck down by lightning in 2008 and then passed away in 2015, the tree itself, the original dreaming tree. But luckily they were able to collect some seeds and stuff to make some saplings from it. So they planted one in Marceline. They planted another one in an undisclosed location, and they planted one that was actually in Disneyland. And they planted it in Tom Sawyer Island, but then they realized that there's guests there, and guests aren't always great to anything. in the park, is they like to, destroy things just because that's what they do. It's a cottonwood tree, just to let you know what kind of tree it is. But the tree, they moved it from Tom Sawyer Island, and then they moved it over to the Lakota Village, which is there today. This is not the best picture because it's kind of lost all its leaves, but you can see right there behind the fire is where that tree is, and that is a son of Walt Disney's dreaming tree. The other dreaming tree that's in the park, they just planted in Toontown. They have a tree that is in the play area for the kids, and that is also kind of represent Walt Disney's dreaming tree, which I think is really special. Let's go to our next story here. We're going to talk about the tree hunt. So the landscaping for Disneyland back in the day when they were first developing Disneyland in 1955, well, more 1953 to 54, their budget for landscaping was $360,000 for the entire park, which is really not that much money for landscaping, especially if you know the cost of mature trees. So they had to find ways to get all of the landscaping for the park at a reasonable rate. So Bill Evans said we would call cities and see if they were tearing out any trees for improvements and go and buy them. We got many that way. They got some, at this point, Santa Monica, Santa Ana, and the Pomona freeways were all being constructed. So they paid $25 per tree, and the contractor was going to bulldoze them and take them to the dump anyway. So the fee ensured that he kept them away from the trees, and they didn't bruise, like they protected them essentially. They would put them in box and like make sure nobody touched them. That was all the price was for, basically. So as fast as we could, this is Bill Evans, he says, we'd get in there and put a 6x6 box around the roots, which was anywhere from 5 to 10 tons a unit, and then pick up the tree and drive it down to Anaheim and give it a new home. There's some great video footage out there that's really fun of, you can see the tree like moving, like you can't see the person driving in, and it looks like the tree is like moving itself from the construction days. That was really fun. The other way that they would get trees is they would drive around in the evenings and hunt in neighborhoods with art director Harper Goff. Bill Evans and Harper Goff would do this. And they also ran ads in the Orange County newspapers in search of anyone with big trees they wanted to get rid of. So this was all like, they're just like throwing stuff out there for how can we get trees at a cheaper rate. But during their hunt in the neighborhoods with art director Harper Goff, he says, we drove around in places like Pasadena, seeing great big nice trees. And we go up to people and ask them, any chance you're tired of that tree? We'll give you $200 to carry it away. Most of the people looked at us like it was some kind of joke. But they knocked on doors of houses with promising trees and they offered to buy them. In Beverly Hills, they found a banyan tree shading the lawn of a magnificent house. So they drove by it many times en route from their nursery to Anaheim until it became an obsession. And it was a wonderful tree is what they said. Each time we passed it, we talked about getting it and became kind of a joke. And finally, I thought, what have we got to lose? So Harper Goff ran the door. I do like Bob Goff. He's the reason that I'm doing Disney Cicerone, by the way. I read his book Dream Big like years ago. So side note, that's why Bob Goff was on my mind. But Harper Goff rang the doorbell and asked if the owner would consider parting with the tree, that they would replace it with a flower bed or anything he wanted. And the man laughed and said, that big son of a bee out there, I'm so tired of that thing. It was blocking the sunlight coming through his front window, so he didn't like it at all. He said, the trouble was, it took me a week to convince Jack that the owner had actually told me that I could have it. It was the tree that went around the original Burmese temple, and we got it for nothing. So they got it for the cost of installing a small tree in its place. And then they put the banyan tree in the Jungle Cruise next to the recreation of what he calls the Burmese temple, then became the Cambodian temple, and it's still there today. So that banyan tree you can still see when you're in the Jungle Cruise and you're going through. You can see the one that looks like it has roots just kind of growing over the face of like the sculpture. That is a banyan tree, and it's really impressive though how it has grown since then. But that is how they got that tree from the Jungle Cruise. So our next tree story in Disneyland is called the Secret Clubhouse Tree. So this is about the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse, Mickey Mouse Club Treehouse, not Clubhouse. That's a different thing. The Mickey Mouse Club Treehouse that was going to be in Disneyland. So this comes from the 1953 concept art and prospectus for Disneyland. And the prospectus basically was the book they would put together to present Disneyland to investors to try to get them to invest in Disneyland because nobody knew what it was. It was such an unknown concept at this time, this idea of a theme park, because they knew amusement parks and whatnot. And, a lot of them are dirty and awful places. They were unsafe. They were not great things to invest in, and you wouldn't want to put your company name on that. So they made this document. Nat Weinkauf wrote this document that was this prospectus for Disneyland. It is a fascinating read. There's a couple different versions of it, and so it changes slightly as they kind of refine what they decide they want to do. But this one is from the 1953 version, and it says so they describe all the things that are going to be in Disneyland. And so this is a little excerpt from that. And it says, you will notice an island in the river. So they're talking about the rivers of America at this point. So you can see some of the original concept art here. You will notice an island on the river. This is the Mickey Mouse and Minnie Mouse Island, the headquarters for all members of the Mickey and Minnie Mouse Club, an international organization. When a member arrives in Disneyland, he or she must find their way to the treehouse that will be established on the island. I do have a picture of the treehouse as well. This is from that big, giant Herb Ryman concept art where Walt Disney begged him, because they said, you know what, these investors, they don't want to read all these words. They need to be able to see the actual picture of what this thing is going to look like. So he begged Herb Ryman to sit down with him in a weekend and sketch this entire giant aerial map out, which is something that's really interesting about this too, is that this castle, the original Sleeping Beauty castle, it was more storybook castle at this time. It was going to be about right around like 500 feet high compared to everything else that's in the park. Clearly, it got a little smaller than that. But you can see over here in the river where we're talking about, you can see that tree that they're discussing here. So it says the only way to get to this tree house is through an old Tom Sawyer tunnel under the river, which will bring them up into the trunk of the tree. Then they will climb up to the tree house and register, and after they've registered, they can look through the limbs of the tree. These limbs are telescopes and periscopes, and they can see all over Disneyland. Now, obviously, this never actually made it. They opened Disneyland without basically anything on this island except for some really scrubby vegetation. And then in 1956, by that point, they finished it and they made it Tom Sawyer Island instead, which was not in this original prospectus. So at some point there, they decided to change it instead. But it's interesting, though, that it was going to be kind of like a lookout, because that was something they did consider putting in Sleeping Beauty Castle, was something that was called a camera obscura, which some of you might be familiar with. But essentially it uses like a refraction or reflection of light through like a pinhole that makes this, like, you can see like a 360-degree view of something. This is something I saw when I was in Edinburgh. There's a couple other places in the world that have one, but they went to go visit the one that was on the Santa Monica Pier. And they said it would be really great to be able to see a 360-degree view of Disneyland from the top of the castle. So if you've ever noticed on Sleeping Beauty Castle how it has like one kind of like circular turret on it that kind of sticks up, that's where, in theory, that's where the camera obscura would have been. Obviously, they scaled it down and it's forced perspective and everything. Like, nobody can actually like go up there and do anything now. But when they were doing this research, they had somebody come in that knew about camera obscura, and they said, you know, is this possible? Can we make this happen so people can have this view of Disneyland? And they said, you don't have enough light in this location to make this feasible. So I don't know. My knowledge of camera obscura is like, you know, that's about what I told you. I've seen one, I've witnessed it, I've done a little bit of research, but I don't know exactly why there wasn't enough light, because you would think there was plenty. But for whatever reason, they said, like, this wasn't a good location for this. So they changed their plans and they took it out, and nothing was in Sleeping Beauty Castle for a long time, except for a whole bunch of feral cats, which we've talked about before. When they went to go and decide they wanted to put in something in 1957 inside the castle. When they went inside, there was full of feral cats and a lot of fleas. And the fleas kind of attached themselves to, like they said, who was it? Ken Anderson, I think, was wearing a white suit. It might have been Ken Anderson. I don't know for sure, but somebody was wearing a white suit, and like when he walked out, it was black, because that's how many fleas there were. And they were all like panicking, and Walt Disney was like, no, you can't like run through the crowd like this because you're covered in fleas. And so Walt Disney like picked up the phone and he was like, you know, like, get me a car. And they're like, who is this? And it's like, it's Walt Disney. And they said, you know, you have to, he's like, no, get me a car, get me out of here. And so they came, but they brought like a motorcycle with a sidecar, so it only had room for Walt. So he hopped in the sidecar, and he's told the other guys that were with him, and he said, stay right there. Don't go running through the crowd. You're covered in fleas. And they're like, what? And so as soon as Walt took off, they started running for backstage, because they were not going to stay there getting like eaten alive by fleas. And so they're running through the crowd with, like they said, I think the way they described it was like fleas flying off behind them. And they got backstage and they didn't have any other clothes. So they sent their clothes to the laundry in the costume department, and they had to put on whatever costume they could find that fit them in the meantime, so that they could have something to wear while their clothes were being laundered so they could go home. So anyway, that was a little bit of a rabbit trail, but that's definitely one of my favorite Disneyland stories of the fleas that lived with the feral cats in the castle. So this is called the Definitely Not Stolen Tree. So we're going to talk about the Bolander pine that is often misidentified as a mugo pine that is inside the Storybook Land canal boats. So this one is probably something, if you know Disney history, you've probably heard this fact and story before. But this is the oldest living thing in the park. It's a pretty well-known tree, but I like the story about how they got it more than just the fact that it is the oldest living thing in the tree. So it has been there in the Storybook Land canal boats when they opened in 1956, June 16th, 1956. They needed trees that would not grow too tall. They needed to be miniature because of the scale of all the tiny little miniature houses in Storybook Land canal boats. Funnily enough, they also had something that they experimented with is that they wanted to have tulips, but they wanted them to be short. And so they I don't know who thought this was a good idea, but they took tulips and they planted them like way down in the dirt so that they were like just like their same tulips, but they're just like they buried them essentially. And of course they didn't grow. Like that's not what tulips are made to do, but they did that for a little while. Anyway, so they needed trees that would not grow too tall. Which is interesting because Walt Disney himself said that trees have no scale. He was so finicky like that. It was weird that he wanted everything pony sized on Main Street. He wanted it scaled down, like it was smaller, 5/8 scale. But when they said, well, what about the trees, Walt? Like the trees are going to grow. He's like, trees have no scale. And they're like, what? So anyway, obviously at this point they needed to have miniature trees for this attraction. So they discovered a tree growing near Van Damme State Park in Mendocino County, north of San Francisco. This was a coastal park noted for its dwarf pine and cypress groves. So if you are familiar with the West Coast at all, because of like the high winds on the coast and it's cold with really high winds, a lot of those trees get dwarfed that way because it's just like they're just hanging onto the rocks. So that's kind of how these trees got real small. But it is illegal to remove trees from a state park. You're not supposed to do that. So the Disney landscapers found a way around that. They went and saw this particular tree was outside of the boundaries of the park. And so they got permission legally to remove it and planted it in Storybook Land canal boats. And that is why it is there now. So they did not steal it. They did have permission, but it almost was stolen. So definitely not stolen. So the next story we're going to tell is the tree in the upside down. I don't know if you guys are Stranger Things fans, but that is something that my family really loved. It's fun because we actually watched it with my older son, my teenage son, and he really loves that show as well. So I was thinking about the upside down. So this is where we're going to talk about what they had to do to make the Jungle Cruise. Now, before we talked about the landscaping and all the things that they had to do to get the trees for Disneyland. But the thing that they planted first in Disneyland was actually the Jungle Cruise because they needed it to grow an entire year and give it a fighting chance of looking like something. It's really hard to make a jungle out of nothing, an orange grove. So they planted that in 1954, so it'd have a full calendar year to grow. It still looked pretty scrubby, to be honest, when it opened, but at least it was growing, So unfortunately, because they pretty much ran out of budget for landscaping as they were making Disneyland, and they did they did a couple of weird things to kind of like combat that, right? So one of the things they did was they had like a heat wave and all the grass turned brown, which is Southern California. That's what it does, right? But for opening day, they needed it green, so they painted it. They spray painted the grass green, which is, I wish we could see more color photos of that. Unfortunately, it's all black and white back then in 1955. But the other thing they did was Walt Disney said, just put some Latin names on the weeds, like put little signs in front of them, and people will think that they were plants that we paid for. So they did that too. But another thing that they did was they wanted to make some like mangrove looking roots in the Jungle Cruise, so that kind of look like a swamp. But they did not have a budget for mangrove trees, nor was it a swamp where they would naturally grow. So instead, they had all these like walnut trees and orange trees that they had removed, and they were in a big old pile. I think they burned them eventually. From my understanding, they burned them. They also, fun fact, this is the Disney World fact. I was reading about how they basically scraped all the vegetation out of Bay Lake at one point, and then they burned all of that to like get rid of it. So I thought that was really interesting. But anyway, they took the old walnut trees and the orange trees and they flipped them upside down and stuck them in the Jungle Cruise. So I do have a photo of this one for you guys. And then they stuck a whole bunch of moss and orchids on top. So you see those things that look like sticks. Those are just upside down trees inside the Jungle Cruise. But they thought, maybe it says they had the inspiration of turning them upside down to get a kind of mangrove effect from the gnarled roots, onto which we grafted the top half of the orange truncated also to get branches. It was a pretty good illusion. So those were all over the Jungle Cruise when it opened. I feel like, and I do have a good picture of what it looked like, how scrubby this whole area was. You can definitely tell today it has grown up to be quite the jungle, an actual jungle with its own kind of like ecosystem. But back then it was somewhat shorter. And that is also why we have canopies on top of the boats on the Jungle Cruise, because it limited your perspective to what was in front of you, and you couldn't look up at the trees that were not very tall. So that's why we have the canopies as well. Also, they benefit from rain and sun and whatnot. That's true as well. But here's another photo you can see down here at the bottom. Just some tacked on moss and vegetation onto the top of those upside down trees. Yeah, it has grown quite a bit since that time, for sure. This one is a close-up color one where you can see that big purple, that flower that is on top of the upside-down tree. Now, these don't exist anymore. They did remove them, but they do have something in them in the Jungle Cruise as kind of a tribute to what used to be there. So pay attention. I'm pretty sure that they're fiberglass now, if I had to guess, but they look like this. And they do have these little upside down sticks that are in tribute to the original upside down trees they used to have there, which I think is really fun that they kept those around. This one you can see kind of near the beginning, off to the left if you're going on the Jungle Cruise. So, okay, let's see what else we've got. Oh, this one's interesting. And this one has new information that I really haven't talked about yet. So even if you've seen the live stream that I did on this, or even if you've heard me tell these stories before, this one actually has some new information, because I'm always learning Disney history. I don't know everything. I'm happy to always be learning new things and new information. So we're going to talk about missing trees in Disney. And this one's really interesting because this is a story about the colorblind bulldozer. So know what's coming in case it's something you heard before, but there's two different versions of it. And I'm not sure everybody's heard the two different versions. So there's several variations of this story. The official Disney version, which I've heard my whole Disney history life, which is about 18 years now, is that there was a colorblind bulldozer operator who was working as the groundskeeping staff when they were working on Disneyland, and they were deciding what trees they wanted to remove from the orange groves and which ones they wanted to keep in place so that they could use them for the park, because trees are really expensive, right? They tagged all of the trees, the existing trees, with a color to indicate which ones to destroy, which ones to relocate, and a third to leave in place for later. But unfortunately, the colors that they used for the tags, people didn't realize that the bulldozer operator was colorblind. And so he just kind of like took out all the trees he wasn't supposed to take out, which is super bummer when you're trying to save money and they weren't sure they had enough money to finish Disneyland at that point. So that is a story that most people know. But I have another version that is from Arsdale Van France, who was the one who he started basically Disneyland University. He was the one that started the original idea of training cast members. That was his job. He had what they called the White House, which was one of the houses that the families had moved out of so they could build Disneyland. And they worked out of the White House to train all the employees so that they would be what they wanted for the show, right? They wanted to make them different than everywhere else. And that is, the cast members truly are the Disney difference, is the cast members. So that kind of started here with Arsdale van France. But his version was that it was not a bulldozer operator, it was a colorblind tree cutter. And trees that he mistakenly removed were limited to a small area in Adventureland, where Disney was hoping to reuse the existing greenery to help create the jungle for the Jungle Cruise. So it wasn't like all over the park, it was just in Adventureland. But the problem was so inconsequential that even Bill Evans, who was the lead landscaper, didn't discover it immediately. So Bill Evans said, a few days later, we were walking through the area and I thought this wasn't right. So I checked the blueprints and a lot of the trees which were supposed to be there were gone. So still colorblind tree cutter, a little bit less dramatic than the bulldozer story. I don't really know the truth here, to be honest. It's hard to tell. I think it was Kevin Lively that said, Disney people are storytellers. And I think he's 100% right. I think we really love a good story. And some of these stories are true, and some of them have been embellished a little bit. And so I think that that's probably what happened here, is it probably was a colorblind, tree pruner or something that took out a few trees he wasn't supposed to, but it makes for a much better story when he took out like a ton of trees with a bulldozer than just a couple in Adventureland. So let's talk about the terrifying trees. Now, this is really fun because there's quite a few of them in the Disney parks. And the terrifying trees are all based off of the original animation from 1937 for Snow White. So this is Gustav Tengren's concept art for Snow White, where you can see the idea of these trees reaching for Snow White. And Disney really ran with this concept a lot. Like if you see a lot of the early Disney animation, creepy trees reaching for people was like a thing, right? It was also in Babes in Toyland, I think, also had creepy trees that were reaching for people. It just became kind of like part of the Disney branding for anybody who's in the woods. They're going to have scary looking trees reaching for you. When they were making the park, the same thing applied for it as well. So they had, this is a really fun one because these are the original trees that were in Snow White before they bulldozed them in 1983. And they barely look like anything at this point because they've been repaired so much and painted over. And they did have these trees in Snow White's Scary Adventure until they rethemed it in 2021 to Snow White's Enchanted Wish. But the trees, some of the trees are still there. Enchanted Wish, if you are looking for them, there's the creepy trees are still there, but they've like stuffed them with moss in like their faces, which I think is hilarious every time I see it. Creepy. That's funny. Yeah, so these ones look a little weird. They look like they're melted. But a lot of these original attractions, Claude Coates ended up working on because he was, he just came in to do some like concept art for Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. And he just kind of ended up like staying and then got involved in all the projects. So he did Alice in Wonderland, and he did a lot of these original concepts. And he also did the Haunted Mansion, which we've talked about, a lot of the atmosphere in the Haunted Mansion, which is why we see all those creepy trees that you can see. It says eyes and trees here in the blueprints. We did talk about this way back when in our Haunted Mansion series for Distory. And then, but you can see Mark Davis also had his own version, but his trees are less creepy and more silly. They look like they're smiling with goofy eyes and then like hair coming out of the top of them for the Haunted Mansion. And then there's also, there's ones, this is what they look like now in the Haunted Mansion. They're more spooky. They're really hard to see though, quite honestly. They're easier to see in Disneyland than they are Disney World, just because they use that UV lighting, the glow in the dark lighting more and they use incandescent lighting more in the Disneyland version. They use UV lighting more in the Walt Disney World version, and that is why it's darker. A lot of people just say it's because your eyes haven't adjusted from outside, which might also be partially true in the beginning, but it's mostly because of the lighting is different, and that is why it is darker there. But the other creepy tree that you can find is in the original Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. There was also creepy trees that are kind of like reaching for Toad. We don't see those today. That ride got a major overhaul in 1983 remodel of Fantasyland, and it pretty much changed most of it. It still had some of the same concepts of going through the countryside and also getting hit by a train and going to hell, which I did talk about recently on some content that I created, but it was the original concept for it was called Motor Mania. And instead of going to hell, you actually went to heaven and they would play heavenly music. And they changed that because they thought it would be funnier. People would laugh more if they went to a dark place. So that's how that got changed. But anyway, the idea of these trees just kind of showing up everywhere all kind of originated from this Gustav Tenggren artwork and then became something in Disney history. So now that the creepy trees are just, they're just very prolific. So our last story, number 10, is going to be a tree that's not a tree. And that could only be the Swiss Family Robinson treehouse. Now, of course, this is the Adventureland treehouse now, unless you're in Walt Disney World or Disneyland Paris, in which case it is still the Swiss Family Robinson treehouse. This is the Disneyodendron Semper Florens Grandis, which is the large ever-blooming Disney tree. And so this was modeled after the roots of the Moreton Bay fig tree from the 1800s. This is something they found on the island of Tobago when they filmed the Swiss Family Robinson. I was doing a lot of research about this, the Swiss Family Robinson, because I read a really fascinating interview with Bill Anderson, who was the one who basically saved that script. It was going to be scrapped because they thought maybe we should just make it into a series for the Disneyland TV show instead, because the original book that was written was just a series of stories, and they really didn't have like some sort of like big event and then an ending. You know, like stories need to, right? It didn't have any of that. It was just kind of these series of stories. So he was the one that suggested they introduce the pirates into the story, and they come back around for some conflict before the story ends. So really, Bill Anderson was the one that made that into a movie, and he was the producer as well for that. But it was something happened with Bill Anderson. Even though he kind of saved it, he also kind of almost got fired for his work on Swiss Family Robinson. So what happened with Bill Anderson, he said, I nearly got fired because of that picture. Walt was pretty mad at me because up at that time it cost more money than any picture we had ever made. He felt that I'd spent more money than I should on the picture, and regardless of the reasons, it didn't make any difference. So what happened was, not only did Walt Disney wanted to first have it in Burbank, and they said, like, film it in Burbank, and they said, no, we'd have to do all this, like, post-production work to make it look like they're in a jungle, and it would just cost a whole lot. Like, let's not do that. And then he said, okay, well, let's do it in England, because they'd already filmed a lot of things in England. The reason that they filmed a lot of stuff in England was because their money got tied up in the war. In the 1940s, after the war ended, they were not allowed to take their funds that they made in Europe out of Europe. Legally, they couldn't. So they started a studio filming area there, which is why, if you've ever seen like the denim like registry for the boats in the Storybook Land canal boats, that kind of comes from that period of them being over there because they have the canals there in England, the canal boats. So that's why the Storybook Land canal boats has that. But anyway, they had the studio in England, and Walt's like, let's film it in England. And they said, like, well, no, like, we got really in trouble because they had Bobby Driscoll in a movie over there, and they almost got arrested because they weren't allowed to have somebody who was under 12. Their labor laws, they weren't allowed to bring in somebody from the United States and like who was under 12 and like work there. So they got in like hot water with that one. They had a little kid, you know, for this one, and they're just like, no, we can't do that. So they said, okay, well, what if we like film on location in an island? And they scouted a whole bunch of them, but they eventually did land on Tobago as the island that they used. But the downside of that is that they had to bring in a whole bunch of stuff because it really wasn't equipped for filming a movie in any way. It was very not sparsely populated at this point, very kind of like remote island. It wasn't built up at all. So they had to bring in like a lot of infrastructure. They had to make parking lots. They had to make buildings. They had to make a set. They had to make everything they needed to film this movie there. So 5 months of work go by. They have spent time making like shelter for everybody to sleep in for the crew and whatnot. And then a hurricane blows in, destroys a whole bunch of their structures, floods the entire studio space, and they are like devastated. They kind of have to like go back to square one. So the costs then start adding up a lot. And that's what Walt Disney never actually went to location to see this, probably because he was nervous about how much money it was costing him. So, so he eventually, the movie did finish. And I looked it up, and I want to say it was like number 5 or something in the year 1960 when it was released. It was really high up there. It performed extremely well. Thank goodness. That's probably what saved Bill Anderson, because he said, it says, I would say that it was the closest to the demise of Anderson at Disney. Walt, again, showing you he was a hell of a businessman, felt that picture could be made for a certain kind of price. I cheated that price by almost $1 million. So it cost $4.5 million to create, which was more expensive than any studio film they had made, live action film that they had made at that point. But Bill Anderson said he forgave me because the picture was a real success. But he always had his eye on me, and I don't think I ever threw any money away. He wouldn't let me forget it. He would always needle me. Well, we're not going to throw a lot of money away on this one, are we? But he let me go on making pictures, and he was very sweet, a very sweet man. This is in the Bob Thomas interviews. So if you've ever read the Bob Thomas biography of Walt Disney, he did a series of interviews with basically everybody Walt Disney knew in 1973. And he just like canvassed and asked all their like favorite memories of Walt, what they thought of him, you know, the good, the bad, and the ugly, like give me all the things and I'll write this biography. And that is always why I recommend it, because it's so well researched. So I've gotten to read a lot of his original interviews from that. So a lot of things he didn't put in that biography. And that is where the story comes from, in case you're curious as to where I got this information. But anyway, so they did end up building, of course, this treehouse in Disneyland, which was opened in 1962. Was the culmination of a dream for Walt Disney to have something he wanted his whole life but never got until he was an adult, which is this really cool treehouse. He said, when I was a youngster, the treehouse fascinated me. I suppose they do all youngsters. I built things in the backyard. I organized the kids of the neighborhood to build a treehouse, and now I got just the one I wanted. So this is the original concept sketch for what it looked like in that tree in Tobago. And of course, we have the one today as well. But it really was fascinating when they first opened this attraction. The leaves were red. So the reason that the leaves changed color was because they faded in the sun. They found out the red was no match for the Southern California sun. So they changed it to green instead, which was less apt to fade and look really super weird. But there's some great views from this, which you can see here. And Daveland has these weird ones that kind of like shift back and forth like this. And I don't know what to do with those because they weird me out. The structure of this is also really interesting because it's this massive steel structure that's underneath there. A lot of people said that this was going to be a waste of space. That's what they called it when Walt Disney had this idea for this treehouse. And they also said that no one will want to climb all those stairs. But when this treehouse opened in 1962, adults outnumbered the kids 3-1 when it opened. I think because it was a lot of adults trying, recapturing the idea, that whimsy of exploring a treehouse, things that we wish we had maybe when we were kids and we didn't have anymore. The Disney World version also just is called something a little bit different. It's called a Disneyodendron eximus. So it's out of the ordinary Disney tree. So Disneyland is Disneyodendron semperflorus grandis, and Disney World's version is called Disneyodendron eximus. So the interesting thing for me, for this tree, I also love this. This one says, just in time for Thanksgiving fun, you can go and see Disneyland branches out with the world's tallest treehouse. And it says, now you can thrill to a real Swiss Family Robinson adventure in this tremendous giant. More than 7 stories high, 80 feet wide. It's the biggest in the whole world. Explore the 3 different levels. See how the Magic Kingdom spread beneath your feet. Climb to new heights of fun. And, the interesting thing here for me is that there was a Swiss man who actually came up to like Walt Disney and said, we don't actually live in tree houses in Switzerland. So that was really cute. It's like, obviously, like, I think he just didn't know the movie or the story. I thought that was funny. But for me, the thing that I love the most about this treehouse, and I am glad that the one today does pay tribute to the original one, even if it's Adventureland themed, because let's be honest, a lot of people don't know what Swiss Family Robinson is anymore, which makes me sad as a historian, but I get it. But the thing for me is that it symbolizes that the family survived a terrible storm and tragedy, but they still found a way to adapt to their new circumstances and thrive. And honestly, I feel like a lot of us have been through a lot in the last couple of years. I feel like some of us have been through more than others. And, we all have times when we go through really, really, really tough stuff. And we always have that choice of what we're going to do with whatever it is that we're going through. Are we just going to give up? Are we going to let it, change us in a way that's negative? What do we do with our pain? What do we do with the things that are hard? And like this family got shipwrecked, on this island, and they made this like beautiful treehouse. I don't know, it's a story, but they made this beautiful treehouse, and they made musical instruments, and they had animal races, and they had they just like lived, and they made the best out of what they had. And so to me, like Swiss Family Robinson always represents that you get to choose what you do with whatever you're handed. You don't have to choose to live in so much hurt where you end up hurting others. You can actually choose to find joy and thrive even in dark places. So, well, thank you everybody for joining me for this episode of Distory, this Distorian's Lounge. I hope that you learned a few things about some trees in Disneyland. There'll probably be a part 2 at some point to go over 10 more stories because I only did half of them. But I do hope that you learned a little something, maybe had a few words, a little bit of food for thought for you as you head into your next week. We are going to take just a very quick break from Distory just because I am going to take a week off to be with my family and prioritize them and some rest, which is very, very important as creators, as humans. So we might skip a week here, but we will be back to finish our Disneyland Paris. I probably won't finish in that episode. We'll definitely head into the queue of Disneyland Paris, which has some amazing stories, continuing our Big Thunder Mountain series after that. But I appreciate you guys so much for being with me for this Distorian's Lounge. I hope that you enjoyed all of the really wonderful tree-mendous tree facts, and we will see you next time for Distory.